Now, tonight's speaker is our OAH Distinguished Lecturer, Dr. Shana Bernstein, Clinical Associate Professor of Legal Studies at Northwestern University. She received her Ph.D. in History at Stanford and held a Mellon Postdoctoral Fellowship in Latino Studies before joining Southwestern University's History Department. Her first book, Bridges of Reform, Interracial Civil Rights Activism in 20th-Century Los Angeles, reinterprets U.S. civil rights activism by revealing its roots in the interracial efforts of Mexican, Jewish, African, and Japanese Americans in mid-century Los Angeles, and explores activism during the early Cold War era. Now, tonight she will share her insights, and I just would ask everyone to hold your questions until the end, and when we can come around with a microphone so we can all hear the question. Thank you. Let's turn it over to Dr. Bernstein.
Thank you, Brandy, for that very nice introduction. I also want to thank Brandy, Caitlin Hocklander, and Mark Iverson, as well as the entire Boise City Department of Arts and History for inviting me to come talk today and their work to make this happen. And of course, to thank you all for coming and spending a Thursday evening coming to hear what I want to talk about. It's nice to be back by the mountains, I will say. I'm from California and I live in Chicago, and I often just, you just see flat for a long way. So when I flew over here, I was very, very excited. The small things in life, right? And I understand that the theme of the Fettuccine Forum this year is civil and human rights. And part of your goal here is to explore how and why people have fought for their rights. Well, this is something I've been looking at for a long time historically, and I'm very excited and very happy to be able to talk today about how and why one particular group of people in Los Angeles came to be involved in civil rights activism in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and how and why I think this Los Angeles story matters to the West and even to the nation. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the role of Jewish Americans in mid-20th century civil rights activism. My talk will even have some spy stories, which I hope will keep your attention, along with other parts of what I think is a very interesting story. Then again, I am a historian, so hopefully I can convince you too. This story comes from the book that Brandy mentioned, which is a larger study than just looking at Jewish Americans. It looks at interracial reform efforts, as she said, between Jewish, Mexican, African, and Japanese Americans, and particularly how that work in Los Angeles helped to spark important civil rights changes, not only in Los Angeles, but nationwide. And I'll touch upon that a little bit at the end. Now, historically, most of our understandings of civil rights in the 20th century have emerged from studies of Black-white kind of relations, largely in the North-South framework. Sometimes you get Jewish Americans in there, if anybody's heard of Rabbi Abraham Heschel and his role in the Southern kind of civil rights movement, and I always get their names wrong, Goodwin, Cheney, and Schwerner, who were two of the three were Jewish Americans from the North. So we get that a little bit. But it's mostly things like the Montgomery bus boycott, the Freedom Summer, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., all very important stories. However, in recent years, there's been an increasing focus to look not only at Northern struggles, to see a different chronology, besides the South. They began earlier. They focused on other kinds of civil rights issues that Northern cities were dealing with, like fair housing and employment issues. But I argue, and there's a couple of recent scholars who've done similar to what I'm doing, that looking at multiracial civil rights initiatives and efforts in the West are also crucial for understanding U.S. history. In places with significant populations of Mexican and Japanese Americans, as well as the African and Jewish Americans and kind of mainstream whites in the rest of the country, there was no majority-minority in places like Los Angeles. Various groups needed each other to accomplish their goals. Their civil rights initiatives were different because they were multiracial, but even more than being different, they helped shape national civil rights trajectories. Now, in contemporary society, we tend to think of Jews as part of mainstream white society, although I do think in the last year or so, with the kind of rise of a very visible anti-Semitism, that question may have been coming up a little bit more than it had for the past 40 or 50 years. In the early to mid-20th century, Jew status was uncertain. They faced racism and anti-Semitism. And I argue that they played an important and unique role in civil rights struggles because of their strategic location in between. They were between mainstream white Christian society and more marginalized groups like African, Mexican, and Asian Americans who suffered more harsh forms of discrimination. While Jews faced discrimination too, they also had more access to the power structures of Los Angeles, California, and the United States than other minorities at the time. So their unique status really gave them a particular role navigating between the layers of society. I'll spend the next 40 or so minutes explaining why and how LA Jews became involved in interracial civil rights struggles and how that involvement changed over time. First, we'll look at the 1930s, when I argue that their engagement with civil rights issues emerged. You can see here in my picture, it's not something we see every day, right? Nazi flags hanging outside of downtown Los Angeles department stores. But this is a picture from the 1930s, I think maybe 1935. Very common. Like, there was nothing shameful or hidden about supporting Nazis because the US hadn't entered the war, right? So as Nazism spread throughout Europe, Jews increasingly realized that they weren't safe, even on the far west coast of the United States, an ocean and a continent away from Germany. The realization of their vulnerability sparked a new form of activism to protect themselves. Then I'll shift to the second period, which is World War II, and look at how their activism transformed as LA Jews increasingly realized that they could best protect themselves by helping to protect others too. They shifted from working mostly for their own safety in the 30s to increasingly working in collaboration with other local and national minority groups to ensure more safety for all, specifically through civil rights. And then the third part of the talk will shift to the early Cold War, which I argue deepened their commitment in many ways and led Jews to maintain old alliances and also forge new ones. Then I'll conclude with a brief mention of how I think this matters to a larger story. I'm going to look at one particular organization, which some of you may have heard of. I don't think it exists in Boise, but it's in many cities around the country still, and I know a lot of you probably came here from elsewhere. It's a group called the Community Relations Council, the CRC. The LA branch was the first in the country, and it formed in the 1930s exactly in reaction to this kind of rising domestic anti-Semitism. By the mid-40s, the CRC became known as the LA Jewish community's main intergroup relations organization, and it played a crucial role in building alliances between the Jewish community and other minority groups. So let's start with the 1930s. And can you all hear me? I should ask that. Can you hear? It's coming in and out as I move, but it's okay. All right. The 1930s, the CRC formed in Los Angeles in the early 30s as local Jews realized how much dangerous racial philosophies abroad made them vulnerable at home. Until the 1930s, LA Jews had few organizations that focused energy on defending their community. But Nazi activities and other forms of rising domestic anti-Semitism sparked new self-protective action. Their awareness of danger marked the official beginning of their struggle to fight for their own rights, and later for other minorities as well. Now you might wonder, what kind of discrimination did they face in the 30s? What did it look like? Well, there was increasing exclusion and anti-Semitism, although, like I said before, conditions were better for them than they were for other minority groups. But a small group of local Nazis, including fascist organizations active in Los Angeles, like the German Bund, made their lives increasingly difficult. And here's a picture of a birthday party celebrating Adolf Hitler's birthday in Los Angeles. Just right there, American flag, swastika, Nazi flag, no problem, right? Publicity surrounding one particular incident revealed the anti-Semitic danger lurking in Los Angeles. On September 19th and September 30th, 1935, fascist sympathizers distributed approximately 50,000 copies of an anti-Semitic pamphlet around the city. They inserted it in home editions of the LA Times. They posted it on Southern California telephone poles, slipped it under doors, left it on street corners, and tossed it into automobiles. Now you can imagine that shocked many Jewish and other Los Angeles residents when they opened their morning paper and walked through their neighborhoods. Supposedly, some Times employees apparently had sneaked it into the paper without management's knowledge. That's an open question. The pamphlet accused Jews of displaying, quote, unspeakably bestial degeneracy. It said they had a distinctly racial program, which called for the seduction of non-Jewish girls. This is a typical theme, right? Seduction of girls. And performed lewd and lascivious acts intended to introduce vice and perversions into the lives of small children. Yikes. The pamphlet charged many things, including that Jews own the movies, radio, and many magazines and newspapers, all of which was a part of an attempt to control access to our people. But the main threat to Los Angeles Jews actually came from domestic groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which used so-called gentlemen's agreements to exclude Jews from homeownership and social groups. Restrictive housing covenants completely closed many areas to them. Elite social and business clubs, and even the Chamber of Commerce, here we are, right, City Hall, the Chamber of Commerce in the 1930s LA excluded Jews. Certain kinds of employment barred them. They couldn't work as lawyers except in Jewish firms, so you see a lot of Jewish firms because that's the only option there, or as public school teachers. Back to the children, right? Myths circulated on Los Angeles radio that Jews had caused the Depression. Now, Jewish leaders came together to figure out, what are we going to do about this? This is terrible. And the CRC, this organization that I'm going to talk about, emerges out of one of these 1933 meetings. It began as a watchdog agency to monitor the rise of local fascist and anti-Semitic activities. It focused on monitoring fascist and pro-Nazi groups like the Friends of New Germany, the German American Bund, and the Silver Shirts, as well as other anti-Semitic groups like the KKK. Jewish community members felt both a strong responsibility and a heavy burden for bringing fascist and other anti-Semitic groups' activities to the public's attention. CRC members believed that the officials and the public were not aware or vigilant enough about the threats these activities posed. And again, remember, the U.S. hadn't ended the war yet, so officially, these activities were not subversive, right? So the Jewish community sent spies to actually infiltrate Nazi and pro-German organizations' meetings. That's where you get pictures like this. They monitored their publications, they followed their public activities, and they gauged their influence. Some of the spies were actually refugees coming from Europe, from Austria, who spoke German and could kind of pass as, well, they were, but, pass as insiders when they were actually outsiders spying on these activities. They reported on what cars the people drove, where they drove them, who they talked and associated with, what they discussed at meetings. They tried to persuade publishers of local Jewish and other presses to monitor and expose the Nazi group's activities. It pressed law enforcement officials and politicians to increase their vigilance, often with very little success. It did take credit for certain victories. And here's a Hollywood anti-fascist, meeting that a lot of the Jewish activists were behind, trying to get people to pay attention. They claimed credit for reducing the membership of the Friends of New Germany, for instance, from 350 to 130. The CRC became effectively the main organization occupied with the defense, protection, and civil rights of the LA Jewish community in the 1930s. Jewish community fear sparked the development of what later became extensive LA Jewish community civil rights activism. Now you have to understand a little bit, right? Who are these people she's talking about? Who is in this group? Some of the names you probably will recognize, actually. The CRC drew participation from a wide range of influential Jewish business, civic, and cultural leaders whose connections gave the organization access to local, state, and sometimes national political power. Hollywood figures like the Warner Brothers, MGM's president Louis B. Mayer was involved, the founder of Paramount Pictures, Adolf Zucker, was involved, and the screenwriter and producer and future MGM president, Dory Sherry, was very involved. Business community representatives included executives of large department stores. You guys still know what department stores are? They're disappearing, right? But in these days, this was the era of the department stores. May Company and Bullocks and Barkers, the Macy's of today, really. Leaders of the Jewish legal community, including judges and prominent attorneys, were active. Judges like Isaac Pacht and Stanley Mosk, who both became very active in California politics in later years, and the lawyer Mendel Silberberg. One of Silberberg's contemporaries called him a local kingmaker because of his political influence with people like the LA mayor and even California's Republican governor, Earl Warren. You heard of Earl Warren because he was the Supreme Court Chief Justice, Brown versus Board of Education, and I'll talk about him a little bit later. But these people had connections to those levels of politics. Okay, so that's what I'm saying when I mean they're kind of in between people. They have their foot kind of in both places. The CRC's actions mattered a great deal in Jewish Los Angeles and eventually to a larger political and social world. So that's the 1930s. Now I want to move to the second part, which is to say, well, what happened in World War II? How did World War II change things? Pearl Harbor, 1941, and U.S. entry into the war transformed LA Jewish American community activism in terms of their interest in and involvement with other groups. After 1941, Jews became increasingly oriented toward building bridges with other minority communities. How and why? Well, on the one hand, you have the federal and local governments became much more active in monitoring Nazi activities because all of a sudden that was enemy activity, right? So they stepped in and sort of took over some of the burden that the Jewish community had felt fairly on their own before. And this enabled the CRC to shift to other important issues. So we see how they found a window of time, right? Like, okay, we don't have to do that anymore, at least as much as we were. But then couldn't you imagine they would do something else? Why were they interested in civil rights bridges? Well, they came to realize that to be safe themselves, they also had to help ensure the safety of other minority groups. Their awareness of the importance of collaborating with others came in part from the growth and increasing visibility of the city's minority populations during and after World War II. LA, as with much of the West, including Boise, right, particularly cities, was transforming. And LA went from being a largely white Protestant city early in the century to one whose population by 1950 was approximately 20% minority. That's significant. I mean, not in today's standards that you look at Los Angeles, but for that time it was, including especially African, Mexican, Japanese, and Jewish Americans. You all know about the Gowan Field Army Base here in Boise, right? World War II era air base that brought there had been 595 African Americans in the city before. 300 more came just in that little 2-year period for the air base and the wartime industry. So it happened on a much smaller scale here, but the entire West was transforming because of World War II. Now, many of these diverse migrants, along with the Anglos who came, they came because of stories they heard about the sunny weather and the good life in the spacious city of Los Angeles, and to take advantage of the growing job opportunities. My family was part of the story, actually. It's funny, I didn't know this till later, but my family came from the Midwest, and then my great uncles had been stationed out in LA, and they asked their families, why are we sitting here in the cold when we can go swimming under palm trees and things? So half of them ended up going back because they decided the cold was okay. But this is certainly a common story. My dad later actually came back to California. He didn't like their idea. So why'd you go back? So as the population of Jews and other minorities grew, and as the Jewish community was relieved of monitoring pro-fascist organizations, Jewish Americans came to focus on building bridges. By mid-1943, they frequently discussed ways to strengthen relations with other minorities, especially African and Mexican Americans. And of course, at this point, you probably know there were not really any Japanese Americans left in Los Angeles because they'd all been removed and put into effectively prison camps, right? Including one of which was not too far from here. So the minority population was no longer Japanese American. It was Mexican American, African American, and Jewish American. The CRC initiated a campaign to persuade local department stores, for instance, to include children besides Anglo-Saxon blue-eyed ones in their Christmas displays. I think it's pretty interesting that this Jewish community group is like activism. It's like, we don't like your Christmas displays, but it kind of proves the point that they saw this as something not just about themselves, but a larger issue of representation and other, Christian minority groups' concerns that they were concerned about too. Jewish Americans often played key roles in interracial anti-discrimination efforts, and the CRC became one of the most active catalysts for civil rights coalition building. It used its members' powerful connections to convince the mayor and other leaders to initiate projects to help ease racial tensions in the Mexican and Black communities and deal with local anti-Semitism and anti-Catholicism. Now, I don't mean to suggest that this was an easy shift, to suddenly be interested in other groups. In fact, community members wrangled with each other over and over again about the desirability of aligning with other worse-off minority groups. In 1941, they were reluctant to ally with African Americans. They debated joining African Americans in establishing a California Race Relations Commission to fight state employment discrimination. And while in principle many members believed and they supported it, the dominant perspective won out that, quote, we should not get behind so-called racial bills as Jews and classify ourselves with the colored group. Okay, so that's 1941. CRC members unanimously opposed sponsoring legislation with African Americans at that time. Now, to some degree, this reluctance came from concern about publicly associating with such a clearly marginal group, right, given their own precarious status. But prejudice against African Americans also helps explain the resistance. Though the various minority groups face common problems, they frequently still harbored prejudice against each other too. But from 1941 to 1945, just 4 years, the CRC showed a very different attitude towards building coalitions with more marginalized minority groups. Its post-war stance on cooperating with African Americans to fight employment discrimination illustrates this clear shift. By the late 40s, the CRC listed establishing a statewide Fair Employment Practices Commission, FEPC, as a top priority. Observers credited African American and Jewish community members for initiating fair employment efforts, which Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, and Anglos joined too. By the middle of World War II, Jews had decided that working with other minority groups was in their best interest, as well as the right thing to do. Important thing to mention that I don't have time to get into here, but I'd be happy to answer questions afterwards, is that other groups, Mexican Americans, African Americans, had other reasons, their own reasons for participating, and they were different, and that's important to note. Okay, so now we finished the first two periods, and now we're at the part that I actually think is the most interesting, because I think it's the most surprising, the Cold War. It's surprising because we usually assume that the Cold War has crushed most meaningful civil rights reform. Right, to give a little background, during the late 40s and the 1950s, the United States was fighting a propaganda war against the Soviet Union to convince American and international audiences that democracy was superior to communism, right? The global Cold War, communists and democracy against each other. Part of this meant criticizing anything communist or seemingly communist, often in ways that destroyed the people and organizations affiliated with communism. Anti-communism destroyed careers. If anybody's seen movies recently, I can't remember the what's it called? Dalton Trumbo, I think it was called Trumbo. Really good movie about what happened to some of the Hollywood 10, the blacklist, right? Destroyed careers, led to imprisonment, and even caused some suicides. Civil rights reformers were especially vulnerable, whether they were affiliated with communism or not, because of the similarity between what they were fighting for and what the Communist Party platforms were. For instance, the Communist Party supported the idea of racial equality and interracial collaboration. So anti-communists often attacked non-communist civil rights activists alongside those affiliated with the Communist Party. Dangerous time to be a civil rights activist, right? So you can see how certain kinds of efforts were sidelined, eroded, undermined. But I argue that our previous understanding that anti-communism crushed all meaningful civil rights activism is not accurate. In some cases, the story I'm going to tell you, the opposite was true. The Jewish community's heightened commitment to interracial coalition building continued during the early Cold War, and I even argue that in some ways the Cold War helped facilitate certain new forms of civil rights activism. That's weird. How is it then that in an anti-communist climate that attacked all civil rights activism because of its similarity to communist platforms, some civil rights activism persisted and even thrived? Let me give you an example. The CRC helped support the establishment of a new Mexican-American civil rights organization. It's called the Community Service Organization, or CSO. It gets confusing because we've got the CRC and the CSO, right? The acronyms sound similar, but CRC is the Jewish group, CSO is the Mexican-American group. The CSO was the first enduring civil rights organization for the largest urban Mexican origin population in the United States, the largest population outside of Mexico City, actually. The CSO served mostly Mexican origin people, but also all of East Los Angeles' diverse residents. At that time included Jews, Japanese Americans, African Americans. It emerged in 1947, the very year the Cold War intensified, which exactly illustrates the point I'm trying to make. This new form of interracial collaboration that assisted a previously fairly isolated minority community emerges at the very time that the Cold War is becoming strong, right? That's shaping so much of U.S. politics. The CSO began in LA, but by 1963, it had established 34 chapters across the Southwest, mostly in California, with over 10,000 paid members. What did the CSO do? Well, you can see here voter registration, something that we're hearing a lot about today, right? Voter registration, participate in democracy. It was very concerned with the lack of access that Mexican Americans had. So it went on a campaign to register to vote anybody who had citizenship in the Mexican community. And in fact, it led to the election of the first Mexican-American congressperson in the 20th century. If any of you are familiar with LA, his name was Edward Roybal, and he was a House member for a very long time. They worked on community strengthening improvements besides voter registration. They built sidewalks. They put in streetlights. Here's a sidewalk being built in East Los Angeles. They worked to get old age pensions for immigrants, et cetera. So they had a lot of things that they worked on. They were very effective. It was the first organization to successfully broker relationships between LA's Mexican-American people and the city and county of Los Angeles, a bridge between that population and the power structures of the area. It became the most successful Cold War-era organization for LA Mexican-Americans. Now, most of the activism emerged from the Mexican-American community. I don't mean to suggest otherwise, but Jewish support was crucial, and this is something that has been very hidden in the way the history has been told for a long time. From 1947 to 1950, the LA Jewish community provided the bulk of the funding. The CSO's executive director recognized the importance of Jewish support, explaining that the CSO couldn't operate the next year without CRC funding. The Jewish community consulted with the CSO on legal, political, and financial matters. It shared its expertise in the field of community relations with Mexican Americans, as it also did sometimes with Japanese and African Americans. It helped the CSO to achieve tax-exempt status, provided assistance for legal problems in court cases, helped find employment for Mexican American youth, consulted with the CSO on starting children's camps and dealing with educational issues. And it worked on something that's been in the news a lot here, too, in this country in the 21st century. It worked with the CSO to fight police brutality, helping educate the LA Police Department on minority issues. This is an old story, right? The CRC made cooperation with and support for the CSO a central project. Why? What's the motivation here? That's the big question, right? What makes somebody do this kind of work? Its members believed that the CSO's work was crucial to both the Mexican American and the Jewish American communities. This wasn't just some benevolent, like, let's just help somebody else. This was something that was crucially important, they believed, to their own well-being. The CRC's executive director emphasized that the CSO, quote, exemplified grassroots democracy at its best, promoting democracy by furnishing the means whereby Mexican Americans' civic consciousness may be expressed. Until the CSO, Mexican and Jewish Americans hadn't had a significant vehicle for political collaboration, nor had the Mexican community had a vehicle for reaching local and state power structures. This came from one of the pamphlets, the CSO pamphlets. You can see interracial unity is the message. The bridge is the community service organization. If you see on the left side, that's supposed to be the Mexican American community, and the right side is the suits, right? That's the Anglo community. And of course, this whole bridge is built on money. So it's a fundraising pamphlet, kind of touting the importance of interracialism, right? Now, at first glance, it seems very surprising that members of these two groups would collaborate in the late 1940s and early 50s. Like I mentioned, the Cold War is one issue, but there's another one, actually. If you look at the trajectories of these two populations right around the time World War II is ending, they're going in pretty opposite directions. Jewish Americans are doing better financially, so economically, they're socially becoming more accepted. They're moving out of the East LA poorer neighborhoods to the western part, Fairfax District, if anybody knows LA, the west side, which is where there's still a significant Jewish population. Mexican Americans are finding themselves increasingly isolated in what became really the ethnic barrio, right? The almost exclusively Mexican American East Side neighborhoods, which they still are in today. So at the same time, you say, well, gosh, why would they come together at this moment when they're like physically, economically, socially moving so far from each other? Well, I think these are the exact same reasons that help explain why they're working together. The Cold War and the kind of distance that's coming between these two groups. Think about it this way. Mounting tensions, as the Mexican Americans felt increasingly isolated and Jewish Americans increasingly left their neighborhoods, tensions mounted. Those tensions threatened Jews' safety and security, a threat which increased their interest in minimizing such tensions by helping poorer communities improve their conditions. They and other communities were particularly interested in the wake of the 1943 Zoot Suit riots. You all heard that song, Zoot Suit Riot, right? These were riots that were provoked by white racism, The Mexican and American community responded, with anger from the racism that they were experiencing. And there was a lot of destruction to East Side neighborhoods, which still included a fair number of Jewish kind of residents, not to mention stores, restaurants, apartment buildings that were still owned by those people who had themselves left. Relations between Jews and Mexicans were particularly strained. Like I said, as the Jewish neighbors were moving out, Mexican Americans saw themselves facing increasing isolation. A CSO report highlighted these racial and class tensions on the East Side. Quote, "The obvious contrast between their neighborhoods and those of other parts of the city bred frustration and bitterness among Mexican Americans. These, in turn, found expression in intergroup hostility and scapegoating, with particular reference on the East Side to the adjacent Jewish community." Now, CRC leaders, the Jewish leaders, hoped that their support for the CSO would help soothe these tensions. They justified Jewish participation by explaining, quote, "It deflects the hostility which exists in the Mexican community against the Jews to constructive social issues of benefit to the Mexican American and the Jew alike. The CSO could, quote, by its very existence, prevent race riots such as have happened before in this city." They use words like prophylactic value and things like that. So, again, there's a real clear sense of the importance to their own community of doing this kind of interracial work. Jews valued building support from other minority communities because their own increasing wealth and social acceptance also did not shield them from discrimination. Even as they were finding increasing acceptance, there were still a lot of vestiges of the anti-Semitism that we talked about earlier. LA Jews filed many complaints about employment discrimination in this period. Many private employment agencies refused their applications. Jews found it hard to break into local politics. LA anti-Semites' radio sermons reached receptive audiences. Some of you probably have AAA memberships, right? The American Automobile Association, I do. They listed certain hotels as restricted from Jews. Vandals marked anti-Semitic symbols on Jewish establishments, painted swastikas on temples, stores, and walls in East LA, vandalizing Jewish cemeteries, and destroying Jewish community centers. Jews' increasing mobility did not ensure safety, and many Jews sought strategic alliances as a measure of protection. And back to my point, there's no majority-minority here, so it ends up being a collaboration among many groups. Now, back to my earlier point about the Cold War. Well, how did the Cold War help spark some of this interest? Seems counterintuitive. Well, red baiters, people who kind of went out and sort of targeted anybody who seemed communist or sounded communist, frequently and accurately targeted all civil rights activities as communists, which threatened, like I said, to undermine all equality efforts. Anti-communists accused Jews and African Americans and other minority groups of being communists or fellow travelers, including many with no communist ties or orientation. Reformers like those in the CRC, who hoped to maintain their effectiveness despite the mounting anti-communism, framed their initiatives as all American. This meant articulating a middle ground, again, back to the in-betweenness here in a different context. Anti-communism that still created a place for civil rights, but claimed it was an anti-communist civil rights space. The CRC and CSO reclaimed civil rights from the red baiters, defining their approach as the most American one because it was an antidote to communism. In other words, the best way to fight communism is to promote and create equality. They argued that legislation that unfairly targeted civil rights activists, particularly minorities, was dangerous to democracy. It would destroy democracy even more surely than communism itself. They maintained that extreme anti-communism threatened to repress legitimate, democratic civil rights. Their own efforts, they argued, on the other hand, epitomized Americanism. Explicitly anti-racist legislation would most effectively defeat communism and help ensure domestic security by preventing communists from stealing the hearts and minds of minorities, right? The idea that, if people are unhappy and there's inequality, that's an entry point for the communists. So we can fight that by making it equal. Very strategic, right? Probably also believed, but strategic as well. All loyal Americans who hope to combat communism, CRC allies explained, must help extend civil rights for all Americans, employment, education, housing, public accommodation, since communism flourished when minority groups faced discrimination. At the same time they argued against extreme anti-civil rights, anti-communism, they also spoke against communism. And this is something that's been quite a sore spot in the organized Jewish community since the Cold War. If anybody has familiarity with this, there were trials and purges and, real deep fissures in communities like labor communities. The AFL and CIO split. Within the Jewish community, there was a group called the Jewish People's Fraternal Order that actually was tried, like not an official court trial, but an internal Jewish community trial, and evidence presented, and they were expelled from the LA Jewish community. African Americans went through this. The NAACP, different branches, hunted down those who were communist and expelled them very publicly. So it was a really fraught, tense time for all these communities, given the kind of public suspicion of everybody. But this is where we can also understand how interracial civil rights activism found an actual opportunity here. It's an unusual opportunity. While such all-American anti-communist civil rights activists distanced themselves from more radical-seeming activists, they also looked to build legitimacy by building bridges with other anti-communist civil rights groups. So at times this was Catholics, like the Catholic community was very anti-communist, but in Los Angeles framed its work as pro-equality. So the Catholic Church helped promote this sort of sense of being respectable and acceptable. The same thing happened as Jews and Mexican Americans reached out to each other. The CRC found the CSO's anti-communism reassuring. A CSO publicity pamphlet explained the organization's anti-communist motivations. Quote, "To drive out communism, we must strike at conditions which foster its growth." This is a publicity pamphlet. The prominent Mexican-American reformer, if anybody knows him, he's very well known, Bert Corona, recalled later that limiting communist influence, particularly from the Mexican-American red members, communist members of other LA organizations, was one of the CSO's reasons for organizing. Leonard Bloom spoke for many in the Jewish community when he applauded the CSO's efforts to, quote, "protect itself from being captured or exploited by Stalinist and Trotskyite elements." Bloom urged the CRC's executive director to support an even larger and more expensive CSO enterprise in the future. Right? So the anti-communism really inspired a lot of the Jewish community's interest in getting support from the Mexican-American community. So in this way, Cold War conservatism and the dangers it posed to civil rights activism also facilitated collaborative impulses among Jewish activists like those in the CRC. Okay, so now we've seen how the CRC formed in the 30s as a self-defense group, shifted gears in World War II to reach out to other minority communities. And then during the Cold War, such collaboration continued and even at times intensified. So now it's worth asking, the conclusion of my talk, how and why does this story matter beyond itself? How did Western multiracial civil rights stories matter outside LA, even outside the West? Well, I have a few ideas. First, I think it reveals the importance of integrating Jewish American history with other minority groups' history in this period, since Jews played an important role in certain civil rights struggles. The fluidity and complexity of Jewish American status in the early to mid-20th century make clear the shortcomings of inflexible understandings of race that apply current understandings, right? We have a very different idea about what race means today, I think, back on the past. Moreover, it shows the complexity of a white identity, as Jews historically, at this moment, clearly face a different set of challenges from other whites. Second, while civil rights stories are often told in the context of Southern, kind of white-black, biracial issues, Western civil rights stories expose the role of other groups, like Mexican Americans. They reveal the limitations of focusing exclusively on Black-white relations, which is important, but not the only story, which can't fully explain such diverse historical experiences. Third, connected to the other 2 points, this ongoing multiracial activism in Western cities like Los Angeles influenced the development of later national civil rights policies and agendas, as well as of ethnic movements in the 60s and 70s. And here's where you probably have heard some of the people I'm going to talk about. Cesar Chavez, the farm worker leader, right? How is he connected? Well, he actually got his training initially in the CSO. He learned community organizing from the CSO, the group that came out of Los Angeles, this interracial kind of support community. We have Earl Warren, who I mentioned earlier, the Chief Justice in the landmark Brown versus the Board of Education case, the Warren Court, the investigation into Kennedy's shooting. He came to Washington directly from California, where he had close ties, like I mentioned, to LA community leaders, including the CRC's Mendel Silverberg. His thinking on Brown was shaped by his experience with diversity and civil rights as governor of California for 10 years. There's other examples too, but those are a couple of the most prominent ones. Now, to conclude, by referring back to the Fettuccine Forum, which is, after all, why we're here to talk about the themes and explore how and why people fought for rights, I think this story highlights the importance of pragmatism in coalition building. Jews built coalitions because they saw it as in their interest to do so, not merely out of some benevolent impulse. I think we misunderstand coalitions sometimes. Of course, there were idealists, and there were people who did it for its own sake. But by and large, the bulk of the reason the Jewish community supported these initiatives was because they saw it as pragmatic and in their own interests. Those interests changed over time, but nevertheless, they saw themselves as having a real stake in the moment. So I will leave it there, and then I look forward to hearing if you have any questions I can elaborate on.